the notion of prosperity, the notion of abundance, on a personal, but also on a global level, not just being monetary wealth, right? As you said, it's just been so ingrained in our culture to think that that's the only metric to measure it with. And I love what John Fullerton says. I'm sure maybe you know him, but he talks about the principles of a regenerative economy, right? And one of the principles is viewing health holistically. So precisely this point that it's not just money that's in the bank, but that it's also social capital, relational capital, cultural capital, right? All of that. And that we need to view or value that as important as the money in the bank.
Climate change. We've never faced a greater threat. Yet all that we produce and consume inflates the debt of greenhouse gases we release. We feel them raise the temp, and the tempest we'll unleash will leave us weeping to forget, unless we take collective action, make a pledge to finally change our ways and keep climate change in check, to benefit the planet and all of its inhabitants. We know it can be done, so listen up and join the quest.
And climate change demands that we change everything that we do.
Chad's Climate Quest is brought to you by RegenIntel, activating humanity to become a planet-positive species. Find out more at www.regenintel.earth.
I'm thrilled to introduce today's guest, Julia Zhou, a dynamic impact entrepreneur who's building momentum around sustainability and social impact in the business world and beyond. Julia is the co-founder of Tidal Impact, a global advisory firm that helps organizations make impact and sustainability integral parts of their mission. Through Tidal Impact, Julia and her team are catalyzing positive change by advising organizations and investing in companies driven by social, environmental, and financial returns. Beyond Tidal Impact, Julia serves as president and a founding board member of the Sigma Squared Society, an incredible global network of over 1,000 young founders from over 30 countries around the world. These ambitious changemakers are not only building businesses to collectively raise over $2 billion to drive solutions to some of today's biggest challenges. Julia's journey has spanned multiple industries, from HR tech, where she co-founded a startup to improve workplace wellness through psychology and data science, to a role as an advisor and mentor to various impact-driven organizations. And if that weren't enough, she's also an accomplished pianist and composer, bringing creativity and passion to everything she does. Hi, Julia. It's great to have you on the show. Thank you for coming along my Climate Quest.
Hi, Chad. Thank you so much for having me on your Climate Quest, and can't wait to get started. I love this.
Well, great to have you on the show, Julia. And, like me, you travel all over the world delivering this message to so many different audiences and helping companies and organizations make change. Where are you calling in from today?
Today, I'm calling in from Lisbon because I actually moved to Lisbon. So finally, I have a base after 2 years of nomading around.
There's many folks in our community have been doing that nomad journey. And I find at about a 2-year mark, they find the need to settle in one place. Did you find that to be the case?
Very true. And I still love traveling. So does my partner, but we just feel like we need a base to come back to every once in a while. You need a nest, right? You need a place to be able to call home. And also Lisbon has so many great people here, a lot of people in the climate space, in the impact space. And so it's just a good place to build a tribe and community. And
yeah, absolutely. And I've been noticing a lot of regenerative efforts and projects popping up, particularly in Portugal, and seeming to be a center of one of the great centers of the regenerative movement.
100%. I'm very excited because there are lots of people buying land all over Portugal and trying to turn that into some sort of a regenerative ecosystem and community. So let's see what's going to happen.
That's beautiful. Well, speaking of the community, many people working in climate and sustainability spaces typically have these pivotal moments that push them towards their planet positive impact work. What was the turning point for you? The moment when you knew that you wanted to dedicate yourself to this path? What was the beginning of your climate quest?
Great question. So for me, I'd say it started pretty much right from the beginning when I knew I was going to become an entrepreneur. So my dad himself was always an entrepreneur, and he always encouraged me to believe that I could chase my own dreams and I didn't have to just climb the corporate ladder. And so many years ago, I think almost like 10 years ago, when I was still finishing also doing my university degree, I knew I wanted to do something different. I couldn't imagine just doing the regular thing. And so that led me to explore the whole space of entrepreneurship, innovation, tech. But at the same time, I also went through my own journey, my personal journey of figuring out who am I, right? And what are my aspirations and dreams, and who do I want to become. And I won't go into all the depth of that story, but I personally went through some challenges myself around my own health, specifically, that
Mm.
led me to explore um, the whole, I guess, to me, the meaning of my life. And I then went on to do a lot of different things, such as going to India for a month, going to an ashram. I did different meditation retreats. I tried different alternative methodologies, and I tried so much within a matter of about 2 years, and
Mm.
realized that ultimately there's no separation between us and the world around us, right? Especially between us and nature. We are nature. And so because of these experiences, because of my own journey, transcending my own difficulties, I came to that realization that that's really the case. And so in a way, it was a no-brainer for me to work on something that would create impact, and that would allow me and everyone else to come closer to the source, to nature. There are a lot of details that we could go into, but I guess that's when the belief was solidified. And then throughout my journey, especially also through community, so the Sigma Squared Society actually has been there since the beginning of my career, so to say. It's in itself been around for more than 15 years, but through Sigma, previously called Kairos, I got to know so many amazing founders who were building technology and innovation to tackle the climate crisis. And I was just surrounded by all these people, and it was just, again, a no-brainer of course we have to do something about it, right? I mean, if we have these skills, then it just, I never questioned it. So I guess but ultimately it really started because of my personal journey and the realization that there's that we are nature. Yeah.
Oh, what a beautiful beginning of this longer journey to regeneration. As I often say, the journey to regeneration has many quests along the way. One of them is our climate quest, and there's so many other things. And another one of these quests is our own personal development and our inner work that we have to do to create ourselves as a regenerative self, if you will, right? And so I love to hear that you have been going on this journey. I also went on a similar journey and many quests, I would say, along that for my own personal development. And I find when you go through those quests, if you will, and you experience so much in different parts of the world, and are open to this, open to accept the wisdom of so many different traditions and knowledge holders from all walks of life, that it really has this effect of connecting you to nature, but also connecting you to the communities and to people around you. And it sounds like that had a similar, almost experience for yourself. When you're talking about the communities that you surround yourself with, and being connected to them and being inspired and passionate about what they're doing, that has a similar effect, right? And then when we're willing to take that in and see those interconnections with nature and our fellow humans. But I want to get into a little bit about Tidal Impact, which is an organization that you co-founded, and it's really designed, as I understand, to embed sustainability at the core of organizations and companies, which is a really powerful vision in today's world, I would say. And I think for a lot of companies, this can feel pretty overwhelming. So I'm kind of curious, what compelled you to create this type of organization, and how does it differ from other kinds of sustainability consultancies that are out there?
Yeah. Um, I think the start of Tidal was also somewhat, it wasn't planned, like so many things in life, but at the time I really cared about the topic, and I got to meet my then business partners, and there was a question around how can we really support companies in a sustainable way, companies that are building solutions to tackle these challenges in a sustainable way, because back then, obviously, or generally speaking, in the whole startup scene, there's uh, the there's the chasing of you want to become the next $1 billion company, and the venture capital scene and all of that. And I think I was starting to question that in relation to sustainability, to impact, and to regeneration. And so that's why we actually started Tidal, to figure out, oh, how can we support these organizations? And also, one of my business partners, she's been advising organizations for more than 15 years on sustainability and doing all the sustainability ESG work. So we said, all right, let's try to tackle it from two angles. So one is the financing side, and one is the, all right, let's then help them actually integrate it and, build the strategies and measure the impact, and all these different things. So I guess that's initially how it started. It's been
Mm-hmm.
almost 5 years since then, and a lot of things have evolved and changed, of course. And I'd say, because you asked how are we different, or how do we position ourselves differently, um, I think about a year or two, I came across this framework, which is called the Three Horizon Framework by Bill Sharp. And I really like it because it talks about Horizon 1 being our current paradigm. So, being the traditional system, being the, let's say, capitalistic system, and just the status quo. And then there's a Horizon 3, which we can call the regenerative economy. So, that's where we would like to move to, where everyone is operating in harmony with each other, and it's kind of like the, let's say, the more ideal world. And then there's Horizon 2, which is where the innovation happens, the entrepreneurship, the disruptions, the technology, and it could skew into both directions depending on, well, what the mindset of the person is that is using that technology or innovation. And a lot of the work that we do today is still in the more traditional sustainability space, but I see it as we need to work with organizations in Horizon 1 in order to transition them to Horizon 3, because there are just so many big corporations out there, big industry, right? And that's still what's driving most of the economy. And so, of course, we would love to all move to Horizon 3 immediately, but it's about what they call the dancing between the horizons. So, how can we be a player to help organizations dance and to move a little bit further? And so, that's kind of how I like to see our role, and to really get access into these more, let's say, traditional companies, and then say, oh, what can we do? So, I give you an example. One company that we work with is a Portuguese conglomerate, and they are in a lot of, they're in big industries, so say cement, pulp and paper, etc. And we are helping them to design a better investment framework, so how they can look at opportunities and how they can, let's say, conduct the due diligence also according to metrics in the sustainability world. And if we just look at cement on its own, a lot of people would say, "Oh, it's bad, big polluter, and all of that." But if we don't get them to change, then who is going to do it, right? So, in a way, us realizing that this organization has the intention that they really want to change, but they just don't know how, and then someone like us can come in and help them. So, I hope that that gives a better picture.
Oh no, I mean, totally clear. In fact, it's a similar a model that we have at RegenIntel, and so there's clearly these great connections that we share. So I totally get it. I want to go back to something you said that I just want to make this point. And you said, you were questioning this idea that companies have to be that $1 billion company, right? Like when those startups, and they're always on that trajectory to do that, to become the next unicorn. And first of all, I want to just say that, I really don't like the use of mythical creatures to describe business growth. There's the unicorn, the dragons, and of course now they're talking about regenerative businesses as being the phoenix.
Zebras? Oh,
And so
Phoenix. Okay.
regenerative companies as being the phoenixes and the $1 billion companies that will be somehow regenerative. I often joke that we should in fact be using a mascot like the dung beetle, which is a much better regenerative animal that exists in this world rather than a phoenix. But so I wanted to ask you a little bit about that and the idea that companies have to have this accelerated growth to reach this, this status as a unicorn or as a other kind of mythical creature, a $1 billion company. And do we really need that? Do we really need more $1 billion companies in the world, particularly in a regenerative economy, or even if we're just focusing on traditional sustainability? Is this the way to be focusing on this?
I would say, direct answer, I don't think so. I don't think that's what we should aspire to. We should definitely aspire to grow sustainably. But the chase or the hunt for the next $1 billion company is really part of that current paradigm. And I feel like if a startup wants to succeed in the current paradigm, that's what they need to go after. That's what they need to do in order to please the investors, who then also need to please their own LPs, and the whole cycle. But especially speaking to a lot of companies that do not perfectly fit into that model, it's just, I don't think it's what we need in the future. But it also shouldn't just be viewed as charity and philanthropy when we talk about impact, right? I mean, it's traditionally always been viewed as either or. So I feel like we need to work on sustainable business models, profitable, so for profit as well, but not at the expense of the mission itself. And that happens so many times. And I'm personally quite passionate about also the hardware space, because
Mm-hmm.
the venture capital space is built usually more on software, right? So software scales very easily. You can demonstrate that hockey stick growth, and then you exit within a matter of a very short amount of time. But with with hardware, with things that require long R&D periods, that just isn't the case. And so how do we support these types of companies? And so I've been really trying to figure out how we can also look at different financing models, or look at blended financing to support
Mm-hmm.
these companies in a better way, right? Because there always is a place for venture capital, but it's still a niche. And so there is going to be, also in climate and a lot of other areas, there are going to be high growth companies that need that kind of capital, but then it's still a niche. And so for all the other types of companies, they need other types of financing as well. But yeah, to go back to the question, I think we need to rethink what we are aspiring to, and also why are we doing that, right? What's the reason why we want to become a $1 billion company?
I think that's a good point. Why do we need that? Why do we want to become that? And it's a big question. And I think actually it's one that we had with a friend of ours, Nick de la Forge from Planet A Ventures, who was on our podcast a few seasons ago. Similar kind of questions, and he had a very similar type of answer. Really questioning whether that VC model that we have that have been so prevalent, I think, while it's niche, it's still on everybody's mind in the startup space. As being such an important vehicle for this. But in the end, the VC model itself is, how do we invest in a company, let it scale to quote unquote be a unicorn, and then how do we sell it off and move to the next one and the next one. So I think, we do need a new model. We do need a more not only sustainable, but regenerative business models. And that, of course, that's what we do with RegenIntel, because, and I imagine that's what Tidal Impact and what you've been really doing there, because you talk about embedding impact into the DNA of the company. And it sounds like you started with Tidal Impact as, really looking at startup space, and then maybe that's continuing what you do. But now you just talked about, working with conglomerates in Portugal, with cement companies. Of course, there are many solutions to interventions that cement companies can can implement to help reduce emissions and be more sustainable. Whether that's regenerative, that's a big question, but let's leave that aside. You're now working with corporations and companies, and it sounds like just we really understand that the embedding impact in the DNA, quote unquote, of a corporation that's been in existence for I don't know how long this conglomerate is, but let's say 10, 20, 30, 40 years is a challenge. And one of the issues I find in the impact space, and I want to really ask you this about the concept of impact, because in the impact space, the concept is really, I think, rather misleading, or at least vague. There are all sorts of impact a company can have. An argument from, say the fossil fuel industry is that they are having a great deal of impact, impact on jobs, GDP growth, the well-being of people consuming cheap energy, which, let's be honest, does tick boxes on a lot of all sorts of indicators for improved livelihoods. I mean, there are many economists who can point and check those boxes, and they could say, well, this is impact, and we're having an impact on the economy. We're having an impact on people's lives, even in the arts and community development. Through philanthropic endeavors and through their different things that they do. So I think you and I both know, I think, what we mean by impact. But I'd like to ask you, to define the kind of impact you are trying to engender in the world. And I want to ask you, are we really using the right word here?
Yeah. It's interesting that you asked that, because I've been giving sessions to EIT digital cohorts about specifically that. And I guess there are so many terms out there, right? But mostly there's ESG, impact, and now there's regeneration that we're using. And so usually, maybe you see it differently, but how I like to say it is ESG is like do no harm. And then impact is just do better. And then regeneration would be the next level. But a lot of people, or I guess larger corporations might think, oh, we're doing impact, we're creating impact. But in reality, it's just ticking one of the ESG boxes. I found it pretty hilarious, but there are these tweets by Musk, who was obviously a very controversial figure, but he was saying, oh, like Tesla gets a much lower ESG rating than ExxonMobil or Philip Morris or any of the big, bad guys out there.
Yeah.
And how is that possible? And that's just also showcasing the whole misleading, how misleading the ESG label can be, and how that's not impact. But a lot of people, they would say, oh, they're creating impact just because they're influencing community or providing jobs. But then ultimately their core operation is still creating negative impact. So I feel like then the differentiation between positive and negative impact really needs to be taken into account.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where I land on the issue as well. I mean, impact is a word, and I'm a bit of one of those language geeks. I'm going to be honest. I'm a language geek. I think when we use language, and language is often intentionally used by institutions to further an end, and to me, impact has always meant, we're having an impact on something. It's how your actions influence or move some factor, some other issue or area, right? And it could be anything for that matter. There's negative impact, there's positive impact, and when we just say impact, I actually think this can be very misleading. And the same thing with sustainability. I often argue, and someone who's been in the sustainability business for 16 years, it's a word that means different things for different people. And, we need some words like, as you say, regeneration. And of course, regeneration's been around for decades as well as a concept. And it's, how do we embed those into our frameworks of impact, or maybe regenerative impact? Maybe it's planet positive impact or something along these lines. I mean, surely I agree with you. The ESG indicators have given companies like a starting point for tracking their reducing harm, or I would almost argue I often argue mitigating the worst case scenarios, because really what they're trying to do is they're not even just reducing harm. It's like, how do we not get into that worst case scenario? And I think compliance is one thing, but But to be truly planet positive, impact driven organizations seems to be something very different. And so
Oh, yeah.
I'm kind of interested. Can you share from your perspective in the work you do with Tidal Impact and, of course, beyond Tidal Impact? What are some of those characteristics that set companies apart when they're authentically, planet positive, impact driven, versus those that are just checking the ESG box or whatnot? So what are some of those characteristics of a company?
Yeah, I'd say, and I totally agree with you when it comes to language. It can be very misleading, and that we need to be, because oftentimes I catch myself actually saying impact or sustainability, and I have my interpretation, right? And to be honest, like it's always how we understand regeneration as well, but I just sometimes say it, and then on the other end, it's like, oh, but what do you mean by that, or it doesn't mean this or that, right? So it's not always very clear. I agree with that. Um, and in terms of the characteristics, so I'd say for a truly impactful or regenerative company, there needs to be, so the business model needs to align with the mission, the impact mission, or however we define it. So let's say there's a company that is providing clean water in sub-Saharan Africa. Then the more clean water they supply, the more money they make. So it needs to be aligned in the ideal case, which is also when I speak to startups, right? Who are like, am I an impact startup? Am I not an impact startup? Am I a regenerative company or am I not? I would always look at the business model and how also the business model, the financials are connected to that purpose. And that ultimately comes down to then also what's the intention. So you mentioned earlier that, and you're very right, that in large corporations, they've been around for decades. So it's very, very hard to create real change. And I'd say a lot of the times it's just cultural. So it's because a company ultimately is its people, right? It's led and built by people. And if the intention of those people is not in alignment, then the company also is not. Then there can also be no change. And so that's why I always love talking about, when we talk about regenerating the planet, we have to regenerate ourselves, right? So the change needs to happen inside, and then it can happen on the outside. So even if we go into a corporation and say, we're going to do a report, we're going to do this framework, we're going to do this and that, but if the people at the top, if they don't understand the principles, then they're not going to change the company. And so I think I digressed a little bit, but it's a really important point that I like to make, which is why now I'm almost, it's like, even if we as Tidal Impact work with organizations, but then it's like, where's the personal work that the person has been doing? Have they experienced any of this, right? Do they feel the connection to nature? Do they understand that? And if they understand that, then they will go and create the change within the company. And then everything external can also come and kind of supplement that. Yeah.
I love that. I really appreciate that. And again, it's very similar to RegenIntel's approach, which is obviously regenerative intelligence, very very regenerative. And the way we kind of vision it is, how do we build internal champions? So how do we go into a corporation or an entity and do exactly as you said? How do we develop those authentic understanding of what regeneration really means? Not the greenwashing potential of sustainability or climate or often in regeneration. We have to be honest about that. But how do we authentically, help them see what regeneration is all about, how to experience it, and then you develop these internal champions within an organization, and that helps you further develop and engage with that entity. And I often talk about it as institutional identities, because when we remember that corporations are institutions, and so they have their own identity. So how do we help them incorporate regeneration in its most authentic form as part of an identity that they can then permeate the company? But there's also, you are a data driven, like me. We're data driven geeks as well, right? I mean, I don't want to, throw that on you, but I mean, I wear it with pride, a language and a data geek. But, I think, because I understand, tidal impact and the work that you do is how you're measuring and how you're really assessing, current impact, future impact. What are some of these metrics that you might, like really specific metrics that you might look to assess a company's sustainability potential, or maybe regenerative potential? We call it the sustainability performance potential, regenerative performance potential, that might not show up in a standard ESG report that's become kind of the the compliance vogue of in vogue of companies today. What are some of these like real metrics that you might look to assess that?
Yeah, maybe I can speak to actually one of the companies that we invested in ourselves, because as part of our back then our due diligence on them, we looked at a few of the metrics which were not necessarily the standard metrics. So, for example, so this company is a materials startup. So they basically create 100% plastic-free, biodegradable alternatives to leather. They created a shoe sole, 100% biodegradable shoe sole, and lots of these things. And so obviously we can ultimately, what everyone looks at is like, oh, what's the CO2, reduction of that company? That's, let's say, the easier part to look at. But then we would look at, all right, what would happen if that company didn't exist? Because right now we are using plastic in or leather to because that's the product that they would be replacing, right? So what would happen if they didn't actually reach their goal, if they weren't there? So now we'd be like, what's the, let's say, metric, pounds of waste diverted from landfill, these kinds of things, or X, certain material that would be replaced, and what are the toxins then that would be reduced because this company actually replaced plastic in that sense. So we would look at those kinds of metrics, which wouldn't be the classical metrics to look at, if that makes sense. And then we would calculate, all right, if we look at the next 5 years, and if this company actually reaches their production goals, then this is the total amount of waste diverted from landfill. This is the total amount of toxins that would be, reduced because we didn't look for the plastic solution, but we used theirs.
Yeah, it's a good example. I know a similar company. I think it's called Bamboo or something, and it uses bamboo, which is a amazing product, part of a bioeconomy, in creating faux leather or fake leather from bamboo, and also the soles. I mean, it's an interesting way to how do you create regenerative, bio-based materials that can then not only I mean, obviously it's about reducing how much waste is going to the landfill, how much better emissions reductions is happening, as you just pointed out. It's also sometimes about sequestration. So we're thinking about how we're using degraded land in different parts of the world to grow bamboo, let's say, and then you can measure that sequestration impact and how soil productivity happens and so on. So there's lots of really interesting ways, I think, to measure, particularly what you've just described, like the bio-based economy. But I think there's also this tension that organizations have. I imagine this company that you're talking about, the startup company you're talking about, where they're trying to juggle, let's say, impact and profitability, because when you're producing I guess bamboo, faux leather, and biodegradable materials, and your biodegradable soles, etc. There are higher costs, and if you're doing it right, if you're checking the regenerative boxes of making sure you're growing your bio-based materials on degraded land, and you're measuring sequestration and soil productivity, and you're helping livelihoods of local community, and you're doing all these things, often that the impact, the planet positive impact you're having, can also struggle a little bit with the profitability. So I'm kind of interested to hear from you, as we've heard from lots of folks on this podcast, that these two can actually drive each other in some ways, profit and impact. And I'm wondering, how do you help companies see that impact is a pathway to healthy growth and resilience, and how does that lead to a more a more sustainable, but also a more financially stable, more profitable company? Do you have any examples of that?
I mean, I'd say in the long term, the goal would be to be at cost parity to the traditional solutions out there, right? So in this case, the goal is to get to the same price that the current toxic solution would cost. Obviously, it's going to take time to get there, and we all understand that, but that would be the ambition. And once that is reached, then obviously it's pretty obvious then who would win. But right now, in order to scale, that's what all the customers obviously would be looking at and would be asking. But I would say if a company can demonstrate that its solution is, from a performance standpoint, in this example's case, perhaps even better, more durable, better performing, etc., obviously better for the environment, and then at a certain point in time would also be the same price, potentially even cheaper, then that makes a very compelling case, right? So I'd
Mm-hmm.
say, and a lot of investors looking at these kinds of companies would be looking at that development as well. What's the potential in the future to reach that state? But of course, we're still at a point where there's often this chicken and egg problem. So in order to get to that level of production capability, there needs to be funding coming in first, right, in order to get there. And so I think that's very common in the space when we're at a starting, to scale growth stage, that that's a bit of a dilemma that a lot of companies are facing. But I'm confident that that's something that we can also solve through other ways, not just VC, obviously, but potentially even support by government through policy changes, through grants, these kinds of things, when also other institutions and governments see that this is important. Because in the long run, obviously, it's going to be more expensive not to do this, because the cost of not, we all know this, right? The cost of not doing anything,
Mm-hmm.
of not solving this crisis, is going to bite us back. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the risk, the catastrophic loss assessment, short term, medium, and long term, to the business as usual case is one of the most compelling reasons why we should be implementing all of these solutions as a system. Because honestly, I feel like most companies are, almost no company, I would say, is really embedding into their financial assessments and projections into the future any kind of realistic assessment of risk and the costs of not doing anything. And I think once they do that, if we can get them to do that, it's going to be almost a no-brainer to be implementing solutions.
100%.
But yeah, you agree, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's all, and I feel like, I mean, if we all took that long-term perspective, we wouldn't be where we are today. But I feel like that's especially a difficulty when it comes to public companies, because the
Mm-hmm.
relationship between the actual owners and the companies is so far that everything is just about hitting the quarterly goals, right? It's very, very short term. So there's also something about shifting governance structures within larger
Mm-hmm.
corporations to build in more regenerative principles, because
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, for smaller company to make these changes very easy, right, because we care about this, but then the incentive structures of larger corporations are just not made to favor regeneration and long-term sustainability at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great, initiatives out there that I've been involved in to some extent. Like creating board seats for nature, or board seats for Indigenous peoples and communities, etc. To try to do that, try to embed some of that, some of these principles, and really thoughtful care of, the natural environment into the board actually governance structure. It's super interesting direction. And I do think you're absolutely right. We need that kind of shifting of governance. So it's a brilliant point. How do we embed those regenerative principles? And again, I think it comes down to changing the identity of corporations. And I have to ask, because, part of that changing of the identity, I think in the long run, is changing the very nature of this tension between impact and profitability, which is, what are the other metrics for economic health and success of business other than quote unquote profitability? Like where our economic system is now, even though economics is really based on well-being and the dollar is just simply, or the currency is just, just a measure of how we can, try to emulate or try to represent well-being, but it's become so dominant in our thinking. And I want to know, what are the other metrics? And I know this is sacrilegious, somewhat sacrilegious amongst companies and investors, but what can we envision as other metrics in the long run, other than profitability or the all-powerful, those quarterly profitability or quarterly dollar signs? What are some other metrics that may be just as valuable that we should be looking at?
Yeah. This reminds me of something I recently read about the notion of prosperity, the notion of abundance, on a personal, but also on a global level, not just being monetary wealth, right? As you said, it's just been so ingrained in our culture to think that that's the only metric to measure it with. And I love what John Fullerton says. I'm sure maybe you know him, but he talks about the principles of a regenerative economy, right? And one of the principles is viewing health holistically. So precisely this point that it's not just money that's in the bank, but that it's also social capital, relational capital, cultural capital, right? All of that. And that we need to view or value that as important as the money in the bank. But in order to get there, it needs an identity shift. But I feel like to look at the value that is generated, not just in monetary terms, but in impact terms potentially. So actually, when we also looked at, just going back to this example of when we were conducting due diligence, we were looking at waste diverted, there's the polyester replaced, there's the rubber that didn't go into, landfill in this country, blah, 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 blah. And then we would obviously also look at what's the economic value created based on that. But then we would have both of the sides. So we would have the actual story around the, let's call it impact, and then we would have the economic value attached to that. But it's just so for people to really get a better sense of that, because the understanding of monetary wealth being the primary wealth is still there. But I guess that's also what I mentioned right at the beginning, the different horizons. So Horizon 1 being this kind of thinking, and then Horizon 3 being also about the other types of capital.
Yeah, absolutely. I know John, of course, very well over the years, and 100%. I mean, that's kind of I was kind of steering to, because I do think we need to have fundamentally different ways in which we are assessing and understanding value, and I think that's really the key. Is what are we as a society, as a global society, valuing? And, where there are lots of different economic systems, right? We also think there's one economic system, which is, become the vogue, become dominant in, how we do business and how we do investment. And it's the monetary capital is the primary motivator and drive of what that value means. But there are many other economies. There's many different kinds of economies. There's well-being economies, which is very closely aligned with regenerative economics, and so many other different iterations of it. We can count about 20 different, types of economic systems, and we under the assumption that we have to do one way of thinking, but that's just a construct. It's a cultural construct, and it's perpetuated by institutions that have these identities built over time, but that need change. I guess one question that I would have is like, where do we find the biggest levers that we can affect, say, these institutional identities, or really shift, thinking into other kinds of value, other forms of capital, as John and others frame it, or other kinds of value or well-being, etc. What do you see as maybe some of these key levers that we can be pulling? And is there some issues that you feel can see that change most more immediate, if you know what I mean?
Mm. One thing that just came to mind is also the Bhutan Gross National Happiness Index, right? So I feel like they've done it really well instead of just GDP to have that. And so that obviously a lot of people know about, but I feel like it's a good example of how a government is measuring the well-being of the society also in a different way. In terms of levers, so somehow the first thing that comes to mind is, and maybe it's because it's a topic that I started caring about more over the last year, the topic around Indigenous peoples, right? Actually, also very much inspired by you, and I feel like um, so I always go back to this thing of how do we get people to understand what their relation to the world around them is and what their impact therefore is on the world around them. And then also speaking about communities, right? So what's the impact, the immediate impact that they have on communities, and what's the impact that they have on nature? And with, I feel like Indigenous peoples, what really stuck with me is this thing that they protect 80% of global biodiversity, right? And so if we have these specific champions in these companies, then if we are able to connect them with those that actually are doing the work on the ground to protect biodiversity, which is a big thing in companies right now, right? How do we protect biodiversity, or how do we reduce biodiversity loss and all of this? But instead of making it a very abstract thing, and again, making it about numbers and about, profitability and whatnot, to bring it back to also those communities that are directly affected and that they actually have a connection to as a corporation. And so I don't know if that actually answers the question, but I just feel like um, drawing that connection between those people and yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, thank you for that, for the shout out there, because I will agree with you. I'm going to agree with you, because I also believe that Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' knowledge, solutions, ways of operating the world does incorporate that, as John might say, the holistic health, and it's something that's really embedded in Indigenous ways of seeing and understanding the world. And I've been, as you noted, I've been working with them, Indigenous peoples, for 16 years now, and it's really embedded in all the work that I have done. And I think what you may be touching upon here in some ways is leadership. Um, how we're integrating different ways of knowing and being in the world, and I think you touched about it really early, the very beginning, when you're talking about your inner development, how we incorporate regeneration into our inner selves. And I think that, interacting and really learning, and acknowledging Indigenous people's wisdom can be so transformative for so many people. Doesn't mean that and there's also this idea that, oh, well, does that mean we're going to abandon everything and live like some Indigenous peoples in the forest or something like this? And the reality is that most Indigenous peoples don't live in forests, or don't live in these environments, and they're live side by side us in many ways, and in many places in the world. But they still have these traditional ways of knowing that they can weave together in our more, more, let's just say, Western version of science or of ways of knowing. We can see that sort of integration. I think that's a kind of a form of how we develop as leaders. And I think Yeah, so I want to get into maybe that part of your work as well, because we've been talking a lot about tidal impact, and of course, your view on investment space and corporations. But there's also this really important part of what you do as a leader, how you are yourself a leader. And this is a core part of what we do at RegenIntel as well. Like, how do we create regenerative leaders from your inner being to your community, to your organizations and institutions you're part of? Um, and I know you're an advocate of that, and you're also a responsible leader. And I'm curious because what does responsible leadership look like? And you might point to some Indigenous peoples here, but who are some people besides yourself, of course, being a responsible leader, that embody these characteristics of a responsible leadership?
Mm. Yeah, I like that question a lot. And actually, even at Sigma, our kind of tagline is, what if the most influential leaders today were friends 20 years ago? And obviously, in Sigma, it's all about solving our world's biggest problems, and that involves a huge amount of responsibility. And so, in a way, like, I'm trying to also help the next generation of entrepreneurs become the leaders of tomorrow and become responsible leaders. I would say my examples of leaders are not the typical examples. I mean, a lot of the founders, especially in our space, they will look up to Steve Jobs, right? And maybe
Mm-hmm.
up until recently, a lot Elon Musk and these kinds of people. But that is, to me, following a lot the traditional way of viewing success and wealth. And for me, it is a leader that embodies, in a way, both. So one that is able to obviously create prosperity, be it also in financial terms, but then also is still in service to the world. And I think the service part here is very important, because
Mm.
too many times leaders are not able to check their ego at the door. Um, and I think that then is creating imbalance and is not ultimately impactful. So I feel like it's really realizing that we as leaders have the responsibility to be in service to nature, to be in service to society,
Mm.
and then can the company also operate in both worlds. And so there's maybe you've heard of John Mackey. He is the founder and
Mm-hmm.
CEO of Whole
Yeah.
Foods Market, and he actually published a new sort of like a biography recently, and I really like his story because Whole Foods obviously is a really successful company, but he's been able to lead it with principles of um, I mean, being in service, leading from the heart. That's one of his biggest things. And I feel like too many times people lead from their heads only. It's about the numbers, right? Do we hit the goals? What are the OKRs? All of that, the awards. But leadership of tomorrow, in my opinion, needs to be the leadership that comes from the heart. And I feel like, to me, he is
Mm-hmm.
one of those people that embodies that pretty well, and has been able to successfully grow a company precisely because of that, because also his company is in service to producing more organic or selling more organic food and making people healthier. So it's aligned in
Mm-hmm.
that sense. So I really like that. I also, one of my favorite books actually is the Surrender Experiment. So Michael Singer, I'd say obviously now he's not leading a company anymore, but in a way, because he was leading a big company, I mean, it went through its challenges, of course, but he was in the business world. He was also embodying the values of integrity, of compassion, of love in many ways, of presence. And so that's, I think, another person as well. And then also, maybe third example is a friend of mine who is the CEO of a big conglomerate, billion-dollar company, and he is incredibly humble. He is very empathetic. One of the very few CEOs that I know who is like that, is able to be like that in that space. And so I find that very aspirational, to embody those values while, you know, leading
Mm-hmm.
a company in a very successful way.
Beautiful. I mean, I think that's a really one of the great characteristics you've described, one of the really great ones you just mentioned here, is the humbleness, modesty. I think is such a powerful characteristic for truly responsible leadership. And I really love that last example. And I often talk about responsibility as the ability to respond to the existential challenges of the, let's say, harsh physical world we live in. Most people live in. I mean, everyone has some capability to respond to things in their lives, but relatively few have the means to respond to the global challenges we're facing and create real impact,
Mm,
planet positive impact. So this ability to respond
mm,
is a really privileged position, I'd say. But it's something I think to respond to these global challenges that we're facing. But
mm,
I want to think that everybody in this world has the potential to be uh, a responsible regenerative leader,
mm,
whether that's a leader in their own for themselves, like their inner leadership, like their self, like leading their own lives in ways
yeah.
that are regenerative, or their families, or being a leader within their families or communities or their institutions or the companies like you've described. And I think this is why responsibility, ability to respond, is so essential for building this regenerative economy we're talking about. I'd like to
I
get your
completely
thoughts on
agree.
that.
Yeah, and I feel like the value of integrity is very, very connected to that
Mhm.
because um, I am responsible for obviously myself, but also if I'm in integrity with my values, then that means that I am also in integrity with just what's right. Meaning, if we are facing difficulties like the climate crisis, then if I have integrity, then I have a moral responsibility to deal with that, right? And to respond to that. And I feel like too many people out there just lack that sense of integrity because they are too scared to face public criticism or reputation or whatnot. But if they really are able to take that responsibility because they are in integrity with their values, then they're also able to withstand those external challenges, in my opinion, even though it's hard. Because I guess one of the most difficult things around leadership is to have to deal with a lot of this kind of backlash or challenges, or
Mhm.
yeah, to have to be the one who walks the talk first.
Absolutely. I mean, that's such a key point. It's actually part of my one of the words of my daily mantra is integrity, authenticity, integrity, compassion, and empathy. These are my four like things I say to myself every day in meditation. To remind myself of our journey to these characteristics. And I think authenticity is an important piece of that too. And it's one of the hardest things to kind of grapple with, to be truly authentic to yourself. And then integrity is like how you're, as you just said, that it's walking the talk. So that means, like, your words and your actions are a reflection of that really authentic self. Very
Mm,
hard to do. It takes a lot of, well, like what you've experienced, that the years of personal inner journeying and work and
mm,
quests along the way to really become that authentic self and with integrity. So I love that. I think that's such an important piece. And so, but I also, as you probably we could agree. Maybe we can agree. I'm going to just put it out there. We're having a lack of responsible leadership, or lack of regenerative leadership across industries. And while we can point to some, and I think we all have the capacity or ability to do that, become that, being authentic selves and our integrity. It's kind of a lack of leadership across industries. This kind of leadership. Do you agree with
mm.
that, or what do you think about that?
I agree with that because I think that kind of leadership requires a certain level of awareness and consciousness that we lack. So I feel like that's the, for me, the underlying reason, a lack of awareness, and the
Yeah.
awareness of oneself, and also again coming back to my realization almost 10 years ago of there is no separation between us and the world around us and between us and nature. And if there's awareness of that, then we wouldn't be in this position. We wouldn't have to ask ourselves these questions, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I am in agreement with that, and also a big part of what I'm trying to do is to bring that more into the space of business, of investment, into the startup scene, because there are just so many important decisions that are being made in that space, and there's so much power uh, in the hands of those people. So if we are able to slightly shift their level of awareness and consciousness to elevate it in some way, then they will become more responsible leaders as well.
Yeah, and then this brings me, I guess, to your work with the Sigma Squared Society, because I think this is what this is kind of what you've been describing, and I also love that you said earlier, you referred to this what the question that you embedded, I think, or your team embedded with the Sigma Squared Society. What if the leaders of tomorrow were friends 20 years ago, and building that relationship? And I think that's beautiful, and it's something that I often say with RegenIntel's community. We call it the cosmos of stars, and we say family and friends first, colleagues second. How do we build that kind of familial, friendship based connection first, and then how do we work and collaborate together? So I really love that, and you've described it, and you've really built already. I mean, we're just starting on this, but you've built a network of 1,000 young founders who are, you know, arguably some of the world's most ambitious problem solvers, on building those connections. And we know that young leaders are driving some of the biggest shifts today in impact and in planet positive impact, in sustainability. And I'm wondering, in your view, how do young founders and leaders approach environmental and social challenges, say, differently than previous generations? Is there something different that next generation leaders are contributing to the space? Is there a different way?
Mm, I need to think about that because, yeah, I'm just surrounded by people of that age. Um, I would say there's definitely a stronger sense of urgency. So I think that's definitely what we see. Maybe the one generation above would still feel like they have a little more time, and with every generation, the feeling of time just gets reduced to now we don't have time anymore, and if we don't act today, then what is going to happen, right? And so I think just the sense of urgency is very strong. I would also say, particularly with our community, because we focus on very young people. I mean, as young as I think even 15, so 15 to now mid 30s, because we've been around for a while, um, who are very much about the doing. And so I feel like um, uh, with a lot of other people, especially those that have been around for a longer period in the space for longer. Oftentimes, there's it takes a long time, especially if we talk about corporations, right? It takes a long time for change to happen. And I realized with our community, sometimes someone has an idea or we have a crisis. It's like, oh, let me do this right away. Let me gather a few people. Example: Valencia, we're going to see each other in 2 weeks. The floods, right? Just about a week ago. Devastating. So we had a lot of people already approach us, like, what can we do? So we just said, all right, if anyone has ideas, then let us know, and we'll gather a group, and we will try to support the city. And already we have ideas like, oh, I have this AI satellite imaging technology. I can send it right away to the city and let us do something. And so I think there's um, the mentality of let's just try, fail really fast, and just build, and rather than wait and talk about it for too long, if that makes sense.
Oh no, I mean, that sounds really great. No, it makes total sense. Like this, and I applaud you for taking such an also immediate initiative on how you can leverage this, your community to help and support, Valencia, for example, in the time of need. I mean, they'll be able to do that in rapid iteration. And of course, this idea of failure, I think, may be one of the most. I mean, I haven't heard this as the next generation thing, but maybe that is something, one of the key ingredients of a next generation approach to this. And that I sense of, previous generations are always thinking that failure is a really bad thing and we should never fail and we should strive to always succeed. But actually, failure is an important learning a mechanism. And if you're failing fast, I love that you just said that, failing fast and learning from that and then going on and trying to figure that out, and owning that and not being caught up in like, oh, I'm a failure, maybe one of the most important mental shifts, I think, as you've just described. Yeah.
Yeah. That's very true. And I feel like because we built a community of people who are all like that, we're all, of a similar caliber, all very young, it gets destigmatized because you have so many people who just start a company and then say, oh, like didn't work out, but who would be up for trying something new? And we have so many examples of people who either quote unquote failed their company or stopped it, or who exited their company, and then they find another co-founder from our community, and then they build another company together. And so I feel like, just viewing failure not as failure, but as part of the iteration and pivoting process, because also any startup pivots so many times, right? Mm-hmm. So either one sees it as failure or it's simply just a pivot to a new thing, to a new model.
Thank you so much for that, Julia. And thank you for this beautiful podcast episode. It's been really a joy to have you. But to close out, Julia, I have one last question. I ask it of all my guests. And so I ask you, what is your vision of a regenerative future? And what's your role in achieving it?
Great question. My vision for a regenerative future is, and I go back to, it's almost like closing the circle, go back to the beginning of what I said, is where we as human beings recognize our relation to Earth, to nature, meaning that actually we are recognizing that we are nature. A friend of mine says there is no circular economy because we're nature. So, we are part of it. So it's all one in a sense. And so I feel like my role is to help people understand that and to get there and to remove the obstacles by creating bridges between worlds that are not yet talking to each other. So in a way, also what you're doing, right? Because you're translating the wisdom of Indigenous peoples in a way that the people in the Western world can understand. And I feel that my role in many ways is also similar because I speak the world of venture capital, of business, of startups, but I also speak the world of those people who are living those principles of being in harmony with nature. And so long-winded answer, but that would be my wish.
Well, it's a beautiful vision of the future, Julia. And it's no wonder that we are friends first, colleagues second, on this journey together, because it sounds like we are very much in alignment as we knew that before. It's been an absolute joy, Julia, to have you on My Climate Quest today. Your journey and insights have been incredibly enlightening and impactful and planet positively impactful. And I'm sure our listeners are just as energized and motivated as I am and carrying this inspiration forward. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and experience with us.
Thank you so much, Chad. It was a pleasure to be on your podcast, and I agree. I feel very aligned with you and hope that we'll work on many great things together.
That's it for this episode of Chad's Climate Quest. So stay tuned for our next episode when I will be talking to another planetary-grade thinker and doer, implementing solutions to create a regenerative future. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm thrilled to welcome you on My Climate Quest.
This podcast is brought to you by RegenIntel, a public benefit advisory and education platform training the next generation of leadership for a better planet, and co-produced and distributed by our incredible partners, Better Worlds, Source Studios, and Shikonomy. Special thanks to Michael Katijian, aka Inverse K, for the incredible intro number for Season 3 of this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others. And to learn more about RegenIntel, check out our Foundations program at www.regenintel.earth/education. Applications are accepted all year round. See you next time on Chat's Climate Quest.